Excellent. So if you can hear me, Shine, if you just give me the thumbs up, so everything's good from my end. So thank you. That's perfect. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. And we're going to talk a lot about multi-location. So this is 2:30 in the night. I'm joining you from India with lots of mosquitoes for company. On behalf of the organizing committee, which includes Shine, Jiyoung, Bina, Kushi, and several other supporting members, I extend a very warm welcome to everyone joining us for this very, very special event today. Annyeong Hasiyu to our Korean colleagues, who along with the International Feminist Journal of Politics are the co-conveners of this, of what we call this multi-location hybrid conference. And we are calling it Remapping the Feminist Global. The IFJP is pleased to host this conference from July 21st to 23rd. So please note the date. It's in about 2 weeks, July 21st to 23rd. And that's this year, which means 2 weeks from now, along with the Asian Center for Women's Studies at the Ewha Women's University. The main conference will be based in Seoul and Korea, while our Pacific and Southeast Asia regional hubs are based in Australia and the Philippines. If you haven't looked up the amazing program, please do so on the website of the IFJP. We have also shared it through social media, Twitter, Facebook, whichever you can access. The important reflection, I think, at this point of time is that this conference to us in the organizing committee, to those of us who've been part of the planning process, sets many precedents, including a very, very vibrant collaboration between two important feminist journals, which is one of the first of its kinds in a way. So as part of remapping the feminist global, we also have a joint issue, special issue that we have planned, and IFJP is going to host one special issue, and the other will be the Asian Journal of Women's Studies, which is hosted by the ACWS. And we'll have an open call for it, so look out for that in early 2023. So why are we here today? This is a conversation starter, and we are super excited about meeting and greeting so many participants in person and virtually today, as well as in the third week of July. Today, we have gathered here to kick off the conference with a very, very special event, what we are calling a pre-conference conversation, honoring our late colleague and feminist inspiration to many of us here, Teresia Teaiwa. Thank you for joining us, and now I hand over to Shine to tell us a little bit more about what unfolds. Shine.
Thank you. Hi, kia ora, everyone. The reason we wanted to start with, and I thought it was appropriate for us to start with Teresia's words and work and life, was because in some ways, when Swati and I were talking about it, it's that she helps us guide our work and our sense of self in academia and in the world, and in every day. That makes and that pushes us to be braver. But at the same time, after the conversation that we had, I was like, brave is not the right word. What is the language that we need to kind of move in a way that is grounded on liberation, and to stay focused despite all the anxieties and distractions and busyness that comes with being part of this world. And so Teresia's work in some ways really pushes us to actually work with language that isn't here yet. Work with the language that isn't quite a means of communication, but a means of marking a presence. And just reading this beautiful, beautiful compilation of her work, I haven't seen it all kind of together in this way as a body, right? Like a thing, organic thing that you could sort of hold, has been really important, not just for this conference, but also as Swati and I, as part of the editorial team of IFJP, are doing our work, right, as part of the journal. And so I wanted to kind of end with, just start us with these Teresia's words on poetry, tree, and scholarship in her chapter, final chapter of the book, Scholarship from a Lazy Native. And we all promised before we started that we're not going to cry, so we're not going to. So do you want to remember who bulldozed and chainsawed poetry? Do you remember how we remembered to salvage the poetry? Do you remember? Yes, you remember how our scholarship is made from poetry. So thank you. And now on to Katerina.
Oh, wow, what a perfect, beautiful way to start everything. And get us in the right emotional frame of mind, which my sister Teresia was so good at doing for everyone, wherever she went, and to whatever audience she was talking to. She had that ability to kind of draw out the very essence of what all of us were feeling. So thank you so much, Shine, Swati, and I can see Bina there as well, who I know is traveling. Bina, you're so kind to join us in the middle of all your movements. Wow, this is such a special occasion for me being in this space with all of you. I know that Teresia's feminist colleagues and the International Journal of Feminist Politics were things that Terry cared a lot about. And so I really appreciate you all making this space to reflect on and discuss her work in this very special pre-conference, hybrid, multi-sited, multi-temporal gathering. I can't see everyone else, but I know this is going to be recorded and put online as well. But Kamna Maori, Nisambula Vinaka, Kia ora. Greetings, everyone. Normally, I would be zooming in from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra in Australia. But right now, I believe I'm zooming in from the lands of the Algonquin Confederation in what is now Westchester County in New York, from Teresia and my youngest sister's home here in Scarsdale. So it's wonderful to be with all of you. And I am a bit fuzzy and quite jet lagged. So I just want to present that context in case we all get a little bit fuzzy through this conversation. And being real is what Teresia was very much about. So it is absolutely okay to be fuzzy and to feel all the things that we're feeling, because we're living in quite challenging times, as we all know so well, with so many challenges and so many issues that all of us and our families and wider communities have to manage. So thank you so much for making this space for us to gather and reflect on her work, to all the hardworking team behind the conference, trying to do what you're doing from all your different locations. Kampasin Bapa. Big thank you as well to the panelists who will be speaking today, a couple of whom are some of my very closest friends that I have known for a very, very long time. To April Henderson, who is one of the co-editors of Teresia's collection, Sweat and Salt Water, and currently the Director of Pacific Studies in the program that Teresia founded at Victoria University of Wellington. April is joining us from there. My other dear friend, Maria Baj, who is an amazing scholar in Māori studies and Indigenous politics, who's also at Victoria University of Wellington, and I believe a recent board member, somebody who's joined the International Journal of Feminist Politics. It's so wonderful to be in this space with both of you. And we're also very honored to have Cynthia Enloe from Clark University in Massachusetts. Am I correct? I hope.
You are absolutely correct.
Yes, nailed it. Who was very well known to all of you and very dear to the journal, I know. Thank you so much for being there. Throughout her life, Terry always talked to me about Cynthia Enloe and showed me her book all the time. So it's brilliant to be in this space with you. And also to our other panelists who actually can't be here in person, but has made a recording of her contributions. Megan Mckenzie, another well-known feminist scholar in international law and human security from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. We will be listening to a recording of her contributions to this panel. And then we have others who I'm hoping will speak to Terry's impact on their work and their lives, who are also here. Bina, if she has time and is able, Jindy, and also Sandy, who have also joined us as well. I'm hoping that you will speak and make your contributions as well. And Beth as well, is that right? Shine and Swati. I'm just trying to make sure I'm naming all who have gathered today, and I will do my best to try to moderate. But generally, I'm just going to hand things over to the next person, and they can introduce themselves in more depth and talk about their relationship with Teresia and the impact of her work. So thank you, Kampasan Rapa, to everyone who helped make this happen and who has gathered here today to honor her work. So each of us will speak to our relationship and this collection of her work and her impact on various disciplines, including feminist politics, Pacific studies, and Indigenous studies. I am going to provide a bit of personal and life history context for people, and then pass over to April, who will talk more about the Pacific Studies program and the process of putting together this collection. Shine has already showed you the book, but we'll talk a little bit more about the process and the thinking that went into Sweat and Saltwater, which was published by the Pacific Islands Monograph series of the University of Hawaii Press and also Victoria University Press. So we got it simultaneously put out by two different presses, which was brilliant because it was really important that her work be as accessible as possible to as wide an audience as we could get. And much of her influence was in the Pacific and in the United States and in Aotearoa as well. So my elder sister was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, where our Banabin, Ikiribas, and Fiji Island father and African-American mother from Washington, D.C., where they met and married while studying at the East-West Center and University of Hawaii. After graduating, they moved back to Fiji, where my father was from, and where Teresia was raised, and my younger sister Maria and I were born. The Banabin community that my father belonged to, which is Banaba is in Kiribati in the Central Pacific, had been moved to Rambi Island in Fiji in the 1940s after devastating impacts of World War II, Japanese occupation, and really devastating British, Australian, and New Zealand phosphate mining that destroyed much of the landscape of our ancestral island of Banaba in the Central Pacific. And this history of who we are as Banabans is very much a part of Teresia's story and what inspired a lot of her work and her thinking. Throughout school, my sister was academically brilliant and had a particular aptitude for literature and languages, eventually becoming competent in English, Fijian, Gilbertese, Spanish, and French. And she was still learning Maori and Samoan when she passed away in 2017, leaving behind her beloved partner, Sean Mallon, and two sons, Manoa and Vaitoa. Teresia earned a bachelor's in arts from our mother's Catholic alma mater, Trinity College in Washington, DC. We come from a family where the women were extremely Catholic and the men a lot more ambivalent about religion in their lives. But our maternal Catholic genealogies, I have to say, you know, it's not always that popular to talk about being religious. It's okay to talk about being spiritual, but this very much shaped who she was and who we were. And she was definitely a critical Catholic feminist, but it was very much part of our identities as Banabin and Fijian and African-American women growing up. So she went to Trinity College in DC, and then she got an MA in history from the University of Hawaii and a PhD in the history of consciousness from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where April also did her PhD. She taught history and politics for a few years at the University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji, which is another institution that was very formative in our lives. My mother also worked there. And then Teresia moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand to found and teach in what was then the new Pacific Studies program at Victoria University, where she became a senior lecturer, program director, and then posthumously promoted to associate professor in 2017. And then, of course, she was also a co-editor of this wonderful journal. And yes, over the years, I heard her talking about it and the kind of work she was doing there quite a lot. Teresia had always been interested in the history of phosphate mining and particularly Banabin women's lives and changing roles. But unfortunately, her interests, when she tried to contact the different scholarly gatekeepers of Banabin history, her interests were dismissed by one particular former residential British commissioner and eventual foundational historian at the ANU, whose name was Harry Maud. And he criticized her in a letter as being very non-scholarly because her interests were personal and they were engaged with issues of gender and identity, which he did not think were serious scholarly topics. At the time, you know, Teresia was quite young and she was quite disheartened by his letter in response to her request for access to his archives. So she changed her PhD topic at UC Santa Cruz and decided to explore, she was gonna look at Banabin women's stories and life histories, and that work on Banabin women then still hasn't been done. And I feel this like, wait, and eyes from the other side upon me to maybe consider myself or inspiring others to conduct such important work. But Terry eventually focused on broader critical theory and research on militarism, tourism, and indigeneity in Oceania for her PhD research. As you know, especially through what Shine has shared at the beginning of this gathering, she also wrote many poems reflecting on all her interests and observations in Fiji, DC, Hawaii, California, Kiribati, and Aotearoa. And she was the author of a poetry collection called Searching for Neinimanoa, which was an ancestral female navigator figure from Kiribati. And she also co-authored a play called The Last Virgin in Paradise, a one-act play with Vilsoni Herenico. Her creative work was also published into audio collections, the first called Teresia, Amplified Poetry and Songs, with Sia Figel, the wonderful Samoan writer Sia Figel. And then her final one was an audio collection called I Can See Fiji, Poetry and Sound by Teresia Teaiwa. And both of those are available or bits of it are available on SoundCloud, I believe. In 2007, she received a Marsden Research Grant for her oral history and book project on Fijian women soldiers. And she was still working on that book when she passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2017 at the age of 48. There was just 7 weeks between her diagnosis and her passing. So it was quite a shock for all of us, for many of her family, friends, colleagues, and students. Her funeral in Wellington was incredible and overwhelming for many of us, which involved the flags of all Pacific nations being lined up along the street and people holding those flags as her coffin was brought through to the marae at Victoria University. The scale was quite overwhelming to my father particularly, but it showed her the impact that she had on so many. There were over 1,000 people there. The speeches that were shared were profound and humbling. And there were many tributes that were delivered for her from all across the world, including the composition of a beautiful Hawaiian song in her honor. So for someone so young and from the Pacific, she did a lot in her short lifetime. She had a real global impact that extended far beyond her local, national, and regional worlds. And before she passed away, she had discussions with her husband, Sean, April, and myself about her legacy, including future publications and a permanent scholarship fund at Victoria University that was set up and now funds, which she seeded herself with her own personal funds. And then her friends and students grew it, and the university grew it so that it could exist in perpetuity. It now funds undergraduate and postgraduate students each year in Pacific Studies. April was particularly keen on bringing her Pacific Studies work together, as that was the impact both of us could see coming from the field of Pacific Studies. And we were joined by our mentor and colleague, Terence Wesley-Smith, from the Center of Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, who is the third co-editor of this book. So he was our teacher and he was Teresia's good friend. And so it was a really nice collaboration of the three of us to honor her work. And before we put it together, we also put a bibliography together of all her works, which was published in the Journal of Pacific History. So this is the result of all that work and all of that thinking. And I thought, before I hand it over to April to talk more about that process, I thought it would be nice for us to hear Teresia's voice just for a couple of minutes to get us kind of connected to her spirit a little bit. And the one I chose is possibly a kind of unusual choice to share. It's called Bus Drivers, and it's from the audio collection that I mentioned, which was a collaboration between her and Hine Moana Baker and Des Mallon in Wellington. But if you're from Fiji and if you're from New Zealand, there is nothing more familiar than buses and bus drivers. And that's the kinds of things that she wrote about and the kinds of things that connected her to everyday people and people of so many different backgrounds and contexts and worlds. So Terry knew the names of everyone along the streets of Wellington, including that one homeless guy who was always there that she passed every day on her way to work. She knew, she knew their names. She talked to them regularly. Her observations were very multi-scalar, and she felt everything at all of those levels as well, including her beloved family. So I'm just going to play this for you and then pass on to April.
Bus drivers. Unsmiling Polynesian bus drivers size me up without raising their eyes. Take my ticket and punch a hole where there was already one.
Good. Just taking out some.
Oh,
What is it? What is it?
this is just a thistle.
Okay. Is it a weed?
It's a weed.
Oh,
It's a weed.
These guys are foreigners.
Where are you from?
well, we came from Fiji.
Oh, okay.
Whoa. Yeah. Hey, careful, no.
Some extra minerals in my tea.
So you're a family now?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
live in New Zealand now?
yeah. Live in Wellington, in Mount Vic, so we're city folks.
Right.
These guys are so
Oh, whatever.
Where do you fit into it? You're
I'm
obviously
from across the harbour.
Oh,
Live in town for 12 years. That doesn't count as a city folk.
so how long have you been in New Zealand?
5 years now.
P.S. I love the way the coconuts lean towards the sea in this postcard and in real life too. This sight in my epiphany, coconuts lean towards the sea, kept taking my breath away that day you took us to Savai'i.
Okay, so for me, that sets the stage for Terry and her life and her work in New Zealand. And I will hand it now over to my dear friend and colleague and someone who's been steering all of the waka, all the canoes for Pacific Studies over there since Terry passed. Thank you, April.
Oh, Vinaka, Katerina, thank you for making me cry and then passing over to me. I join you from Te Whanganui Atara, Wellington, Pōneke, acknowledging mana whenua status, Te Teaiwa, and in our wider region, Ngāti Toa Rangatira. So I've been here for 20 years and I was the first hire of Teresia in her fledgling Pacific Studies program, which she founded in 2000 and I arrived in 2002. I had known Katerina long before that. We were students together, as Kati mentioned, at Center for Pacific Island Studies. And through Kati, I came to know Teresia prior to arriving here, which is how she happened to know that I was coming to Wellington on a research trip, and said, hey, I need some teaching support because I've been doing it all alone. But I had actually seen Teresia prior to even meeting Katerina after returning with my BA to Hawaii, which was home for me at the time during a year off while I was working and not studying. I happened to be told by a family friend to go to the Center for Pacific Island Studies annual conference because it might be something that was interesting to me. And it was this very historic conference called Contested Ground, at which Teresia presented one of the papers that we have in the collection. And I was struck by this woman who cried and swore and sang her way through this incredibly creative, powerful presentation that was unlike anything that I had experienced in my undergraduate career. And I was like, what is this amazing scholarly realm where people are like this? And I found out it was, of course, Pacific Studies. So my first encounter with Teresia before actually meeting her was '95. And then through meeting Kati a year later, when I joined the Center for Pacific Island Studies, I came to know Teresia and then arrived here to work with her in 2002. talking about the genesis of the book project, Kati had mentioned Teresia lying in state at the Marae for one of her memorial services here. And I remember sitting next to Maria at that service and how incredibly powerful it was. And Terence Wesley-Smith, our co-editor for the collection, was also in town from Hawaii for that and other memorial services. And apparently in Terence's recollection, I had mentioned something to him about the book and thinking that it would be a good idea to pull her work together in a collection. And there had been precedents for that in Pacific Studies with another, probably the only other maybe, or one of the few canonical figures in Pacific Studies, which is the late Professor Pelihau Ofa, whose work was collected together. So that book served as a precedent. And part of my motivation, I think it was because of the incredible outpouring, and Wellington is an epicenter, a type of epicenter of that outpouring. And the way in which, for anybody who knew Teresia personally, you will absolutely be able to attest to her great personal charisma, how connected everyone she met felt to her. And that was coming through when Kati was talking about, you know, her connection with everybody on the street, knowing their names and their families' names and everything about them. People that she just met felt deeply connected to her. And there was so much around her memorialization that was picking up on these incredible human qualities that she had. And that was so important and incredible. I also wanted, I think in some of that memorialization, there's a tendency amongst, say, her former students to kind of paint Teresia as this sort of kindly mother of Oceania type of figure. And I think that's really beautiful, but Teresia could also be a tough mother. And in her work, she was a deeply challenging, critical, complex, sometimes contradictory in an incredibly generative and productive way, intellectual scholar and thinker. And so in all the memorialization that was settling on what I worried might be sort of a reductive characterization of Teresia as this kind of saintly, kindly figure, I didn't want to lose sight of the critical scholarship. And I thought if at least a lot of the essays could be pulled together in a book, anytime somebody in, you know, mostly for other people who are in academia or scholars, anytime one of those people sort of tiptoed into a reductive characterization of Teresia's intellectual output, I could be like, sort of easy corporate body that I could just say, here, there you go, get back to me. So that was one of my personal motivations in wanting to see the work pulled together. And then Terence, I really have to give Terence credit because I was keeping our program alive as the sole full-time staff member for 18 months until we got somebody else on board. And I was quite stretched thin. And Kati is always incredibly busy. Terence was edging into retirement, and as he puts it, you know, kind of looking for sort of a project that he had a lot of love for, and this was it. So he took it on and he did a lot of the initial footwork. In terms of the structure of the book, it's divided into 3 sections. The first section, we pulled together Teresia's work that is about the field of critical Pacific studies itself. That was one of her great bodies of work where she said anybody who is in Pacific studies needs to actually think deeply about what Pacific studies is and what Pacific studies can and should be. And so a lot of her work about learning and teaching in Pacific studies and about the field itself is in the first section in the book. And then because her another significant research vein was on gender and militarism, that work is collected together in the second section of the book. And just pulling it, the work of pulling it together, I mean, for me, because I taught with Teresia and worked with her and was very close with her for the 15 years we were here together, there's just so many kind of personal connections to the essays. Obviously, her work on teaching and learning in our program is talking about the courses that we both teach or have co-taught together. And so I remember the moments that sparked some of the anecdotes or the metaphors or the remarks in the book. But even in the gender and militarism section, the most recent publication in that section is an essay called The Articulated Limb, where Teresia is pushing these ideas of articulation, which she and then subsequently I encountered through our PhD supervisor, James Clifford, at History of Consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He in turn was pulling them from Stuart Hall, who was reaching all the way back to Antonio Gramsci and various others. But Teresia had been quite dissatisfied with the metaphors or models that people were using to explain this theory of articulation as, structures coming together and presenting themselves as a whole, which are actually produced in very specific historical and spatial contexts. So something like culture, in my class in Pacific Studies, we always talk about representations of culture, which get presented to people as this kind of neatly tied up whole thing, but which get produced in specific contexts. And so Teresia looked at structures of militarism. And we co-taught a paper together, Theory and Methods in Pacific Studies. And I would come in and teach the bits on cultural studies methods and teach theories of articulation and kind of their genealogies. And I viscerally remember Teresia sitting at the opposite end of the seminar table and our students all in between, and this look on her face, because she's a very engaged listener. And the look on her face was, as I'm trying to sort of explain theories of articulation, the look on her face was just like clearly not satisfied. And eventually she kind of has this outburst, because Stuart Hall's metaphor that then James Clifford reproduces is the metaphor of the articulated lorry, this British metaphor of, the truck and then its container that it hooks up to, and the idea that these socio-cultural ensembles, like military industrial complexes, are these articulations of structures and institutions and also sort of like deeply felt ideological beliefs all hooking up together in one particular time and place. And I was explaining it using, the Stuart Hall lorry metaphor, that these things get hooked up together. And Teresia was like, no, like those metaphors presume that the unhooking can be done easily, that the truck can just pull in and unhook from its container. And she goes, no. She goes, we need to also talk about some articulations being more like an articulated limb. The idea that, yes, your skeleton is an articulated skeleton, but it's bound together by tendons and sinew and flesh and skin. And yes, you could lose an arm, but if you were to lose an arm, it was going to be painful. It was going to be traumatic. And for her, she was like, we need to also think about articulation as potentially involving trauma. And that is what she thought of and then wrote about across 2 articles that are in the collection, because she said these military complexes, like the military culture religion complex in Fiji, these are articulations that are going to be deeply painful in Fiji for people to unhook from, but it's still necessary to unhook from it. But we just need to confront how difficult it's going to be and not presume that it's going to be some easy unhooking. So this even, that article, The Articulated Limb, which was published posthumously, was the last of her gender and militarism articles. It was just sort of like, I remember that moment that was kind of arising out of her dissatisfaction with me trying to teach theories of articulation. And then the final section, which I'll just wrap up with, is there are bits, Kati remarks about them. They're pieces that speak more personally to her Banabin ancestry. Some of her kind of personal and political and cultural theorizing that didn't neatly fit within the Pacific Studies section, although some of them overlap considerably. Her essay, The Ancestors We Get to Choose, comes straight out of our PASI 301 class, but also speaks about personal end as well as intellectual genealogies. Yeah, so that is some background on the process of pulling the book together. We're deeply grateful to University of Hawaii Press, our editors and the incredible team there, especially the people at Center for Pacific Island Studies who all helped out with that. Jan Rensel, it was a labor of love for many people there. Jan Rensel, our incredibly detailed editing, various wonderful people who helped, and then Victoria University Press here, Fergus Berriman. So that would be me. I probably went on longer than I initially intended, so my apologies.
That's okay, April. Thank you so much for giving us some of that background and context for the book, but also going into detail on articulation, which was something that was important to her work and that a lot of people take away from her work and then try to work through. I'm more a fan of remix myself. So maybe that's another conversation we're going to have between articulation and remix. But passing it over now to Cynthia to share with us. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to be here with all of you, but it's very special as well. Teresia had such an impact on my way of thinking. I mean, she really, Jindy Petman is also here with us, and Jindy was the start. Let's give credit where full credit must be due. It's Jindy who opened the door to the Pacific for me, and it was Teresia who said, okay, now you have to go deeper, right? Deeper than I was going. Jindy was then at ANU, and when I met Teresia for the first time, it was because she organized a conference, a workshop really, which is the best, right? Because you work, right? You don't sit and become a passive listener. None of us are really passive when we listen, but you can't even pretend to be passive, right? In Wellington about the militarization of the Pacific. And this was at a time when I was just being woken up to the levels of and the kinds of and the sneaky quality of militarization, island country by island country, local culture by local culture. And I mean, I knew Fiji wasn't Samoa in terms of militarization. I knew Guam wasn't Cook Islands, but I didn't know why or how, and I barely, again, thanks to Jindy opening my eyes, but until then entering further, I barely knew how to think about gender. I was very conscious of both the colonial and the religious colonial. I'm so glad Katerina mentioned, as you all know, you can't go to any Pacific Island country and not be aware of which church colonized it, right? The Baptists are not the Methodists, and the Methodists are not the Mormons, and it was really kind of engaging me at that level that was so eye-opening to me. And she was really, Teresia was the one who brought, gosh, I can't remember, maybe there were 8 of us that she brought to Wellington for that conference. And it was really to get us to, you can probably remember, April, really get us to be concerned. I mean, to be curious, that is to do more research on the militarization of the Pacific. And for me, that was starting with Guam because of the US militarizing uses of Guam, but also to spur other people to be interested in the Pacific. One of the things that happens in our very siloed, I'm afraid, our very siloed, quote, area studies is that Oceania studies is left out entirely from Asian studies. I early on was a Malaysia specialist. I never call myself that now, but that's where I started off. And I remember when Teresia and Jindy each were trying to wake me up, both intellectually and culturally, to the Pacific, I realized that I had never heard a single paper presentation event at the Asian Studies Association on any Pacific country. And I really was realizing how damaging that siloization, if you will, of area studies was to everybody. Then Teresia and I, as April and Katerina have mentioned, really drew me into her research on Fijian women in the Fijian women in at least 3 different militaries. That's why her work is so expansive and so eye-opening, because she was interested in Fijian women's experiences of being part of the Fijian military, which is, of course, a military that's performed coups d'etats and, you know, Fijian women who've been part of the British military, which has a big Commonwealth contingent, has had, especially if they can't get enough British local men to join. Then the Commonwealth becomes quite a feeder in their eyes. And then thirdly is Fijian women as members of private military companies, which Sandy Whitworth has written so much about. And the genius of Teresia's curiosity was that she didn't mush those 3 things together. And she really helped me understand that the way that a woman experiences being a member of the Fijian military, especially because most of them were ethnic Fijian, they were not ethnic Indian, right? Which Katerina can tell us a lot about. So they were not just Fijian women, they were ethnic Fijian women, not ethnic Indian women in Fiji. And their experiences of being, quote, Commonwealth recruits in the British military, and then their joining because recruiters came, because recruiters knew that Fijians were very recruitable. They were militarized enough to imagine that joining the military was a way to make a better living, to support your family at home, to see the world, to become part of Fijian lore, really, by being part of these global private military companies. And I remember during the US-led war in Iraq, and Teresia, can't remember where we were, maybe in Fiji. We were talking earlier that she was in Fiji to see her parents. And I was there just passing through, and we spent a day together. And I think she said, have you thought about the Fijian woman who's doing laundry for American soldiers as a contract worker in Iraq? And of course I hadn't. I mean, I think about laundresses a lot, actually. It's one of the ways to think about what it takes to run a military. You have to think about the laundresses. But I had no idea any Fijian woman was being recruited to work as a contract worker for militarized laundry services in Iraq. And that's really stuck with me. I think about the Fijian woman doing military laundry then just outside of Baghdad. This work that she was doing, and I'm so glad that you've included her work on militarism and militaries, not the same, in Sweat and Salt Water. I think it's so important for people to really, as you said, April, to realize what a deep and globalized thinker critical thinker she was. And one of the things that struck me about when I've heard her present her work, and she always wanted to be a standalone. I think it was one of her, Katerina, don't you think it was one of her disappointments? I think she was always just on the brink of, I think I can finish the book now. But of course, being a very curious person, right, April? Being such a curious person, she was never finished. You know, she always wanted to do more interviews. She wanted to really rethink. So at the point where I heard her present where she was, one of the things that I really loved about her. So here's somebody who's a critic of militarism, who's devoted years of her life of taking seriously women in several state militaries and private militaries. There's a contradiction for you. Somebody who really was an edgy thinker about what militarization was doing to various cultures and countries and peoples in the Pacific. And yet she had the heart and the brains to take seriously women who joined militaries without thinking about militarism, Fijian women. And one of the things that she revealed, this is why she was never going to finish this book. I kept saying to her, don't worry about it. Just, you know, tell us what you do know. Don't wait for the final chapter where you're going to wrap it up, because you're so curious and you're so engaged. You are not going to go finish this project. So you might as well tell us what you know when you know it. And that was that she began comparing the different generations of Fijian women, and a generation that came during the Cold War, a generation that came after the first coup, a generation now. And I thought, and she was so humane and thoughtful about how a woman who joins even the Fijian military, let's say 3 women joining the Fijian military, but 3 generations, they didn't experience it or think about it or weave it into their notion of themselves and their lives the same way. And it reminded me, and I needed the reminder, that women, quote, women in militaries are always interesting, but don't imagine that they're all, even if they're from the same country, that they're in the same historic moment, because they aren't. In the history of gender in their country, in this case, Fiji, in the history of militaries, in the history of militarization. I know that both Sandy and Jindy will say more about the journal, but Teresia had such valuable contributions to make to the IFJP, the International Feminist Journal of Politics, precisely because she was a multi-talented, multi-curious, situationally rooted person. And I think it's one of the great contributions that the IFJP has made to intellectual life, is that nobody has to give up their sense of rootedness to contribute to this journal. This is not, right, Jindy? Nobody, Jindy was the first home office, if you will, of the journal there in ANU when we launched it. Jindy was the first. And the journal is not, and it never has been, I think this is different than a lot of other academic journals. The IFJP never was kind of universal. Globalized in its conversation, yes, but none of us imagined that, right, Sandy? None of us imagined that we were somehow floating above where we lived, where we learned, where we taught, what we wrote about. And I think Teresia just put that in neon, if you will, that the geographic specificity of each person enriched the journal rather than had to be sacrificed in the name of something called, I don't know, whatever people call it, academic something, right? That has never been what the IFJP asks of its editors or its contributors. And Teresia just really underscored that in a way that was very liberating, I think, for everybody, and very enriching. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Oh, that's brilliant to hear from you. Just contextualizing all of that, but particularly her work on, women in 3 different military and militarized contexts. And I just want to quickly add that it's a little bit like religion and how that's influenced our family, in that my mother came from a military family. And so Teresia's interest in the military, a little bit like how Catholicism influenced our lives. So you have these big institutions and all their structures and their histories kind of, bring to bear upon her scholarship and her thinking and her identity, but also her humanity combined with the critique. So my grandfather was a colonel in the US military and worked for the Pentagon. I only recently went through his bio again, and there were like stars and hearts and different kinds of military awards that he received, but he worked for the Pentagon, and before that was in the Korean War and in occupation of Germany after World War II, and Terry had a military ID when she was doing her undergraduate studies at Trinity College. And so she could go onto bases, and people saluted my grandfather and my grandmother too. So that's a particular grounding and context, but also part of the, for lack of a better word, authenticity of her engagement with militarism and military context, because it was personal, just like everything else, it was personal. So it's part of that grounding as well. Not to mention the militarism of growing up in Fiji, where you had to go through a checkpoint to go back and forth to our house. Like, we grew up with guys with guns at military checkpoints for a good portion of our lives. So thank you for reminding me about that too, because that's part of that context.
No wonder she didn't like the lorry.
Yes,
analogy.
the lorry, it was like, yeah. It was like, this is embodied. This is embodied stuff. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on now to Maria Baj to make some other connections for us regarding Teresia's work. Thanks, Maria.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou e hui hui mai nei. Ko Maria Baj ahau, no Te Aroha me Ngāti Awa, ko Lucky Te Kuri tēnei, kia ora koutou katoa. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the introduction. Just introducing the dog, Lucky. This is our non-human relation who's sitting in with us listening. You asked us, so many ideas now that I've been jotting down and remembering to go back to. You asked us, Kati, to say a little bit about the connection. So like April, I met Kati before I met Teresia. We were doing our PhDs together at ANU. And, there are lots more connections to talk about. My parents had been in Fiji. They were publishers at that time and had met this amazing woman, Kati, at a conference. So my father had accosted her and got her email, I think, all these sorts of family things. Said, you must meet my daughter. And so poor old Kati was burdened with me tagging around. Anyway, so we met first. And then when we'd finished, I joined, so Teresia was first and foremost the sister of my dear friend, and then a colleague when I joined Victoria University of Wellington in 2004, and April was there already at that time. And I joined, first of all, the politics department on a temporary contract in the precarious nature of these things, and then moved to Māori studies, which wasn't really my field at all, apart from being Māori. And that's where Pacific studies and Māori studies at that time were connected. And Teresia and April were part of the shift to creating their own identity in Va'ao Manu Pacifica. So that's a little bit of the trajectory at our institution. I wanted to focus, partly because I was concerned about the crying factor, so I wanted to focus on two of Teresia's pieces that I really continue to mull over. And in fact, some of the comments, Cynthia, that you made and April made just reminded me of a whole lot of points that are, sort of on the back burner in my brain. But these two pieces we assigned to students in Māori studies and in our Masters of Indigenous Studies. So, there is a legacy here of students continuing to think about these things. And I also continue to think about some of the issues she raised. And the first piece is The Ancestors We Get to Choose, White Influences I Won't Deny. And so I want to talk, I'll just give a little few quotes from the article before I make some comments for those who haven't read this one. But in this article, Teresia describes the piece as a reckoning with what is native about Pacific studies and a subversion of it. And of course, that's what she was always doing, having reckonings and then subverting the reckonings and the disciplines themselves. When education is often coded as a process of whitening for Indigenous communities, it sometimes seems that we should emphasize Indigenous influences over others, she says. And she reflects on the implications of being influenced by white theorists. And she shares part of a genealogy of Pacific studies that she used in her courses, and it sounds like April was doing this hand in hand with her. And she warns the reader that it's profoundly patriarchal, masculine, and significantly white. But she makes no apology and says it's balanced out by students being exposed to plenty of work by other Indigenous and Native scholars, artists, activists, and so on in the program. The genealogy that she gives discusses the works of Terence Wesley-Smith, J.C. Beaglehole, J.W. Davidson, and Ron Crocombe. And she says, to deny the white origins of the field would also be to deny the extraordinary political, intellectual, and academic activism of the white men and later the Native Pacific Islander academics and intellectuals who've helped shape the field. She says, for me, acknowledging the significance of all their work is critical to helping my students understand and deconstruct whiteness. Introducing students to white men who advocated for self-rule and independence and could also be difficult people helps students understand that whiteness is not monolithic. Also, white students need models for both performing and deconstructing their own whiteness, she says. So this is a really important piece for us in Māori studies for a number of reasons. It's part of an ongoing debate and kind of sometimes going around in circles and conversations that we have about which voices to prioritise, which voices to emphasise and which voices to de-emphasise and why. It also connects with the now common practice within Māori and Indigenous studies to note positionality in research. And so there's sort of connections here. As Teresia notes, it is important for our colleagues and students to highlight the many different ways that non-Indigenous scholars have been involved in our histories and telling our stories. And some of those scholars have been both helpful and unhelpful. And one of the key historians that was at the centre of some of these debates here was Michael King, who also, white man historian, did amazing documenting of Māori histories at particular historic moments, but then also began to speak about himself as no less Indigenous as Māori people, and that started to get him into a bit of trouble, and it was rather unhelpful sort of line of inquiry. And critically analysing these sorts of different moves, as Teresia encourages us to, helps to diffuse some of the binary thinking that can result from some of our tendencies within Māori studies and Indigenous studies. Increasingly, our students are non-Indigenous within Māori studies, and that's a huge change in society and politically that we're seeing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they've got slightly more nuanced understandings of our histories, and they ask us what should they do with this understanding that they now have, their involvement in, you know, inherited privilege or inherited trauma. What should they do with this understanding that they have? And so what the role of non-Indigenous scholars and students is in communities is something that we need to deal with to shape a future together. So I think, you know, Teresia's work, this particular question is still really important. Within Māori studies and Indigenous studies, we still face the complicated challenge of the role of Indigenous people speaking about us. And at the moment, we have a sort of simmering, perhaps it's raging, debate around another historian, Anne Salmond, who's faced critique for speaking about Māori tikanga, Māori traditional practices, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and a recent piece where she wanted to start unteaching race, which has caused some outrage in different Māori studies quarters. And we're also wrestling in New Zealand universities, again, with this huge interest in Māori language and culture, but then the question about how to balance these things, how to balance the prioritisation of non-Indigenous students, non-Māori students with Māori students. In our faculties of law here, the New Zealand Council of Legal Education has said that all law students starting next year need to learn about Māori law as a first source of law, well, as a source of law, it's a first source of law in this country. And so again, that changes who's going to teach that? What sorts of readings should they have in their genealogy and thinking about the Cook's law that was brought here to Aotearoa and the mingling of those different laws. So these are all kind of really important and current questions for us, and her piece really helps, I think, with some of the issues. As Teresia importantly also points out, content is not only for Indigenous students, but non-Indigenous students, and ensuring that there are role models for deconstructing this whiteness and seeing how our communities can work together in peaceful and respectful ways. And as Teresia, you know, has pointed out in other places and reminds us, the world's problems that we currently face, including climate change, cannot be solved using only one knowledge system. We need our different knowledge systems combined, our powers combined, and the knowledge from our different ancestors to be able to combat some of these issues that we face. The other aspect of this article that really resonates with me is the broader implication about acknowledging your genealogy, your training and your intellectual trajectory. And I think has implications for scholars, community leaders, artists and activists to be honest about the influences that do inform their work. And there's still a strong anti-intellectualism that remains in many communities here, including Māori communities. And I find that particularly frustrating. And I think this article helps kind of nudge people in the direction of being honest about some of those genealogies. Not so long ago, I was on a panel with a colleague who'd been at another university, Māori colleague, who was suggesting that, you know, sort of poo-pooing academic work and suggesting that real Māori knowledge, authentic Māori knowledge, only exists outside the academy and in community. And in my mind, part of what Teresia may have gently been pushing back in a broader sense in this piece is also about romanticism and exclusionary practices. So that's why, you know, this one's really helpful. And that some of those elements are part of the second of Teresia's articles that I wanted to discuss, which has already been mentioned, scholarship from a lazy native. And in this article, Teresia has her usual mix, I think, of witty irony and serious intellectual discussion. And she talks about Native people in the university, and this is a complicated bit why I've typed it out, and the anomaly of the perceived normality of the absence of Native presence in the university, and the view that the Native presence is, as she says, enabled by the absence of our authenticity as natives. So it's that same kind of question that you're in the university as a native, well, you can't be properly authentic then if you've got that book learning and so on. And here she discusses the politics of knowledge and the role that's often assigned, she says, to natives as the native informant. And Teresia says she'll take this role if she can choose the terms, and she picks the terms as the lazy native. She says she proceeds to make fun of and critically interrogate the insinuations and stereotypes of Native and Indigenous scholars and Pacific states as lazy and dependent. And she kind of digs into that. And she says, part of my motivation for this paper comes from a terrifying uncertainty about my place as a scholar, specifically in Pacific studies, but also in cultural studies. And she talks about struggling to understand how she fits in when she resents many of the dominant assumptions in the field. And recently here we've had a book called Ngā Kite Mātauranga, which is a book of different Māori scholars talking about their experiences in particular disciplines and the silencing and silences that they've seen in their experiences in the university, and some of those dominant assumptions. One of the anecdotes she describes and retells in this piece has really stayed with me, and I regularly tell it to the students. Since reading it about 20 years ago, of course, and she relays this anecdote, and she says, Professor Greg Denning was delivering a brilliant poetic ethnographic rendering of Pacific Island history at a Pacific History Association conference in Suva. And a young Fijian scholar by the name of Simeone Durutalo responded by saying something to the effect that, under the prevailing colonial and neo-colonial conditions, islanders could not afford the luxury of that type of scholarship. And Teresia's the critique continued to haunt her, and she said, I am torn between the desire to contribute real work, true scholarship to the archive, and the impulse to refuse the burden of native representation, surrendering to the impulse to engage in luxurious, dare I say, frivolous scholarship. Why should only white men have the privilege of writing about anything they take a fancy to? And it's that final comment that inspired me, in fact, to research about Māori involved in the privatised military industry. And we talked a few times about some of the dilemmas that we faced in our slightly parallel research. And Kati, what you were saying about the personal and the humanity and the relationships was a key issue as part of that. And I think one of the funny things about that research that I did was that I'd assumed it was just something that took my fancy. I could be quite objective about this project because, you know, it's something different, although it involved Māori people, it seemed like something quite different from my other research. But because of the connections to the people I interviewed, the research could never, ever take an objective and detached form that I'd sort of, you know, frivolously thought it might. It led me back to the families and relationships of my many communities, and we all ended up being connected in histories and kin-like genealogies. And, you know, that I think was the hardest thing about that research. But I'm forever in Teresia's debt for inspiring me then and continuing to inspire me now. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Oh, that's brilliant, Maria. Thank you so much for taking us, for zooming us in to some of this work and reminding us of how it's impacted and influenced people in, you know, like you and your work and your students and Māori studies in really specific ways. Like hearing you talk about this and being reminded about that, it has really like woken me up a little bit. To be honest, because I think sometimes we take, or I, as her sister, take her influence for granted and the specificities of it don't always fully sink in. So being reminded about the specificity of how it shapes, challenges, and transforms people's thinking about certain things is wonderful, is brilliant. Thank you so much. It's a nice transition there, especially thinking about the burden of representation and lazy native, I think, to what Megan wanted to share in her contributions to this panel. So I'm wondering if we can now play that, Shine, and we might just double check the audio. I think we tested it before and it should be okay, but do let us know, people, if there's any distortions.
Hi, everyone. I really wish I could be with you live virtually, and I actually really wish that we could all be together in person for this event, but thank you for letting me join you via video. I just want to start by saying that I'm joining you from unceded Indigenous land. I'm joining you from the land of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I just want to acknowledge my role as a settler and my responsibility in ongoing efforts for reparations, land back, and reconciliation. So thank you again for letting me be part of this panel, and it's wonderful. I'm so pleased to see Sweat and Saltwater, the selected works compiled of Teresia's amazing work. And thank you to the efforts of Katerina, April, and Terence who put this together. I'll make my contribution brief because I know it's always a little more difficult being the video person, not live. I just want to say a couple of brief things about Teresia's work and a reflection on how her legacy today. The first thing I wanted to say is really around Teresia's contribution to the concept of militarization. And I guess what I want to say before I get into that is what I love, what I wanted to start with is to say, I think all of us here just deeply love Teresia, and our reflections on her work are always, at least for me, shaped by just my deep love for her as a person, how much I miss her. And also, I know Emilita Kyling wrote a poem about her where I'll paraphrase, but essentially she said that part of the shock at losing Teresia is that she seemed almost superhuman. And for me, she was almost like a goddess and such an incredible friend and person. I was always just amazed at her energy and the love that she emanated. And as I got to know her better, what is important, I think, for me to add to this is the paradox of that, seeing her as superhuman and how in the end, none of us are superhuman, and all of her efforts were depleted her at some level. And I think it's important to acknowledge the humanity of Teresia and how much the work that she put out, had a toll on her. And of course, she had an awful disease, but it also was exacerbated, I think, by being tired. And I really want to acknowledge that without adding too much negativity. I think, so I'm shaping that in my conversation. So in terms of militarization, what I just want to say is that what's really interesting about Teresia's work is that today in critical military studies, there's been a lot of debate about pushing back on simplistic notions of militarization as a singular process or a liberal kind of departure. And if you look at Teresia's work, this is actually how she's always been kept, theorizing and thinking about militarization. Her work on militarization has been the kind of nuanced, critical decolonial perspective that I think many Western scholars are sort of starting to embrace. And for her, I think it's such an interesting, the work that she did on militarization was so important in raising awareness of not only how outside colonial forces have imposed militarized cultures and militarized bases across the Pacific, but also how Pacific cultures have impacted and responded to and adapted, and in some times embraced and used militarized cultures. So I guess pushing back against this idea of a singular kind of colonial process. And I love her conception of militarized cultures of militarism rather than simply focusing on the process of militarization, and thinking about how different cultures and different peoples have actually responded to militarization and resisted militarization. I guess that's the second point I wanted to make. You know, Teresia's contributions are so vast, and what's very interesting is her contributions are so relevant to international relations as a discipline. Of course, she really situated herself in Pacific studies, even though, which is wonderful, but even though her work had international implications. But international relations as a discipline, for all of its faults, I think was not always the most welcoming place. And that's important to note. So this relates to the second point, is really these, the debates that, at least for international relations, over the past decade or so, this new-ish discussion of decolonization, decolonial approaches, I think for many scholars is a new term. And what I think is important to recognize and important to embrace about Teresia's work is that for Pacifica scholars, and for Teresia in particular, there's never been a kind of scholarship that's not decolonizing. You know, Teresia was educated in her undergrad, she was reading Fanon and Black feminists, and doing her kind of scholarship is essentially always, I think, when you're doing work focused on the Pacific, focused on colonized spaces, you don't have the option of sort of dabbling or using a decolonial lens. And I always really appreciated learning from her about the way that she married her thinking and her theorizing and her work on decolonizing and resisting with her everyday activism. She was a very engaged activist, whether it was about resisting nuclear weapons, environmental activism, independence movements for Pacific nations. And so I think that, I guess even those are just two small points to really highlight how valuable, how, you know, not just ahead of her time, but how essential her work has been, I guess, to many Pacifica scholars, and how really, if we're talking, you know, in this venue with the International Feminist Journal of Politics, I know others will mention her work with the journal, but actually international relations can and should really embrace her work to a larger degree, in my opinion. It's so essential. It was, you know, sort of ahead of many of the discussions that we in international relations, I'm not really in the discipline anymore, are having. So I don't want to go on too long. I do want to just end with a piece that Teresia wrote actually in 2011, and I just can't believe how she sent it to me when I left Victoria University, Wellington, and it was one of the first things I got from her, with just a little note saying, you know, thinking of you. And it was a piece she wrote about retirement and how, as a Pacifica scholar, she dreams of retiring to a simple life, and the double bind of essentially being an academic, trying to work hard to retire, but also being an academic on the periphery and doing work that is considered to be on the periphery. And I want to just share a couple of parts of that piece, because I think for those of us, I mean, for me, I think about Teresia all the time. I wish, of course, she was here. I wish that we could continue just chatting about our boys. And, you know, it's just such a loss on so many levels in terms of for her intellectual legacy and scholarship and all of the work that I know she would have continued to do. But also for those of us that had the benefit of being in her sphere, it just, you know, the wisdom, some of the advice that she's given to me, the support and the encouragement that I know she's given to so many young scholars is just incredible. And so I think today, now, her work and her real honesty about the academy and how it grinds us down is more important than ever. And I do want to highlight that, because it is important to acknowledge that Teresia is no longer with us. And she's one of a number of Black female scholars doing work in international relations who have died too young, and whose deaths were exacerbated, or I think we could argue were exacerbated, or by overwork, by stress. And so that is something that I think as a feminist community, we need to reckon with, especially for the white scholars who are really succeeding in this system, to think about Black women in this system who are not succeeding, who are being pushed down, who are really being worn out. And so I just want to read a couple of pieces from this. So the piece is called Modern Life, Primitive Thoughts, and it was published in Development in 2011. So she said, at the rate I'm going, I will just keep slogging at my academic job until I can retire. This is in the middle of the piece after she talks about dreaming of retiring. This is the fate of the savage in modernity, isn't it? Work, 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 so we can eventually have a life that is close to the one of our ancestors lived. Well, for most Pacific people, that's not the dream. The dream is to work, 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 so we can have lives that are close to the ones we think white people have. Not hippies, because hippies are too much like our ancestors. We are also capable of linear evolutionist thinking, proper middle-class white people. That's who we aspire to be like, except we don't like the way they put their elderly into retirement homes. And then later in the piece, she said, the year 2010 was the pinnacle of what I would describe as the unsustainable years in my life. And remember, she was working for the journal at this time, International Feminist Journal of Politics. In my life anyway, unsustainable workloads, unsustainable cost of living, unsustainable family pressures, all produced a horrible double bind. I must achieve a high level of performance in order to be rewarded professionally so that my family's material well-being is secure, versus I will exhaust all my individual physical and mental reserves, as well as that of my family, to achieve this. The double bind is one of the recurring motifs in Spivak's writing. And later she says that the double bind is unsustainable living. But so many of us have been living with the double bind I described for far too long. It has outlasted the best of us. It has survived the rigor of our analysis and critique, our revolt and protest. It remakes itself after the revolution. It is sustainable. It sustains itself. We are its collateral damage: stress, anxiety, depression, hypertension, domestic violence, state violence, corruption, substance abuse, poverty, animal abuse, environmental degradation. These are just some of the effects of the double bind, and they do not cease. And so I know that that's heavy, but I think, you know, the piece that Teresia wrote is somewhat light, and it's so prophetic in the sense that even as she was working so hard and doing all the things that we admire, she was aware of the double bind, that it was wearing her down. And so I hope that as we celebrate her legacy, we can also acknowledge and learn from and keep resisting the double bind that I know has worn so many, especially of our racialized colleagues down, and to try and forge new pathways so that we can live more sustainably in every way. Thank you for letting me share my thoughts, sending so much love.
Oh, wow, that was so beautiful and appropriate. So relevant to everything we've been talking about, and kind of, you know, brought us full circle with her life and death as well. So I know Megan's not here, but really sending so much thanks and love to her too for putting that together to share with everyone. So I thought at this point it would be wonderful to hear some reflections maybe from Jindy and Sandy to everything we've been discussing, or anything else you want to add in terms of Teresia's life and impacts for you. And then Shine and Swati, I'm not sure what the plan is, but will we end it there after Jindy and Sandy's contributions maybe, or do we can revisit and make space for others after that? I'm just cognizant.
Yeah, just reminding everyone to put their questions or you know, comments or anything they want to contribute in the chat, so we'll bring you into the conversation. So please do that while we hear Jindy and Sandy. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Katy.
Maybe I'll pass it over to Jindy first. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. I'm so delighted to be here, and only wish that Teresia were here with us. I'm sure somewhere she's keeping an eye on us and judging what we do lovingly. I am talking to you during NAIDOC week here in Australia, which is National Aboriginal and Islander, meaning in our context Torres Strait Islander observance celebrations, which are a week long and have been going annually now since 1975. I'm speaking to you from Yuin country on the south coast of New South Wales. And indeed, at this very moment, I'm looking out of my blessed retirement window, with Megan's comments especially relevant, looking at the Pacific Ocean, which nourishes me every day and which connects me to so much, including so many of you. It's a real presence in my life, as Teresia continues to be. She's one of those people who is, in a sense, always there. She didn't disappear from our lives. I first simply want to quickly thank the organisers of the panel and the editors of this wonderful book that's so beautiful. It's been sitting around on my dining room table, and as people wander through, they pick it up and say how beautiful the book is. And I also wish to thank Teresia herself, so dearly loved and sorely missed, and still, as I said, feeling that she is with us, partly because we grew so used to her generosity and her sharing with us as she pursued these various projects and struggles, but also because through her writings, her voice and her presence comes so strongly to us. She really is present in those writings, and it's a continuing and ongoing gift. I'd also like to acknowledge the journal community in its various forms, and the various editors, past and present, and the journal conference that they've also been referenced to, the remapping of the Feminist Global as the theme for the upcoming conference, which seems a really fitting heading under which we can talk about and celebrate Teresia's life and her work. And one of the things that I particularly love is this map, which may or may not be, probably won't be very visible, but it's the map that begins the book, that is a map of the Pacific. And it's a brilliant map. I have always loved this particular way of looking at the Pacific because there are little bits on the side, Los Angeles, Tokyo, bit of Australia over here, but basically it's Oceania, it's the Pacific that's foregrounded and central. And I always find it such a contrast to the International Studies Association map. The International Studies Association being the big forum in which feminist IR found a place and where the journal was originally conceived. And that map starts with North America and South America elongated. Then it has Europe and Africa beneath. And then it has East Asia and 2/3 of Australia at the bottom. So in an attempt to be internationally inclusive, they've actually completely knocked out the Pacific. And that, so just putting those two maps between my eyes, actually for me, among other things, kind of sums up my past working history. I will say just a brief thought about that. I did begin in international relations in the 60s, but first started meeting people in and from the Pacific in the mid-70s when I began work in Papua New Guinea and the Solomons at the time of their getting to formal independence. And it was that actual process of independence at a time when things seem very fluid, when the possibilities of doing the state, doing politics, community, and so on differently was briefly there, I think, in a lot of the debates that were coming through at the time. And it's always interested me the somewhat ambivalent, ambiguous role that Papua New Guinea plays in relation to different notions of Pacific studies and the Pacific. Over many years, under many disciplinary disguises often, I noticed that I always gravitate, if there were Pacific women's groups, presentations or whatever, to those ones, partly because the people were so wonderful and partly because I just felt more at home there than in a lot of the international relations and so-called Asian studies areas. And through that time, I was starting to think about forging my own feminist politics of location, in which the notion of region was very important. But region for us here, and still until very recently, and again, the Solomons comes back as an actor, the region meant Asia, this big conglomerate, and the Pacific disappeared. And it was within that context that I made some very dear friends and learned a lot. One of those dear friends was Claire Slatter from Fiji, who introduced me to Teresia, and we talked thinking that it would be completely wonderful if Teresia could join Sandy and Catherine as editors of the journal, because it's always been my passion that the Pacific should be present, should be remembered within the journal community, and indeed the formal journal structure. And that is, again, happening in quite a significant way. And so that was the initial connection with Teresia, and the joy that she, knowing her, reading her, has brought me and continues to bring me. So I'm very grateful for this panel. Thank you. I did want to say several things, but both Maria and Megan have basically focused on the very parts of this collection that I was wanting to pick up on. So I think to share time more, I will simply confirm that the range of issues picked up, the kinds of connections that are made, the kinds of spaces that are made where we can make those connections. We can imagine things differently, that we can build our solidarities while staying, as we must as feminists, really acutely aware of all of our different locations and investments. That project, I think, even from somewhat weary retirement, is still really challenging and really exciting and totally ongoing. Just as Cynthia was saying about Teresia, you'll never be finished. We'll never get it done. But certainly one of the great joys always to me has been the people alongside, the women, the feminists who are there too, that are part of the joy of keeping going, even when it really is exhausting, and really, really important that we all do remember about self-care and caring for each other too. So I'll just leave it there, I think. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Handing it over to Sandy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to say a few words here. I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island. I'm actually at my son's dog sitting, so if you see me being dragged a bit to the side, it's because Derek thinks it's time to play. I want to start by saying first, thank you to the editors of IFJP for organizing this fantastic panel, to the editors of that collection, and both the panel and the collection, I think, so captures the my sense of Teresia, and that sense. Jindy mentioned the prep that was involved in Teresia joining the editorial team with myself and Catherine Eshley. And of course, as in all things, that was managed all via email. But we met in person for the first time in Madrid, because right after Teresia joined as part of the editorial team, we realized the Women's Worlds were being held in Madrid. And Teresia was briefly in the UK, so was relatively close. Catherine is in Scotland. And so we decide what a perfect way to meet. And when I get there, Teresia and I had, I think, about an hour as we sat down and chatted and got to know one another a bit. And I think that, like, the sense of, like, for Teresia, the wholeness, the organic whole of her life and her work, the way in which boundaries did not separate the academic and the artistic and the personal. I remember the first part of our conversation, we both have sons. So feminist mothers of sons sometimes have interesting conversations. I have no idea what particular challenges we were each facing at that time, but I remember we both really appreciated each other's empathy on what we were facing at that time. And Teresia then, and forever, throughout the time I knew her and in her passing, I think one of the things I posted when I heard she had died was Teresia she was a mother bear. You know, she was a tough mother, indeed. She had high expectations, and she was a defender of her sons in a way that went to her core, and that I didn't. There was something in it I recognized and connected with. In that conversation, we not only talked about our children, but within maybe half an hour, I knew that she was a writer of poetry, that she did spoken word poetry, that she connected her spoken word to found sounds, part of which Katerina shared with us earlier from I Can See Fiji. And I don't know where I ordered that from, but I got it, and luckily I had it when Teresia was still alive, so I could talk about it. But I just recommend it to all of you. Google it and find where you can get it. It is such a beautiful piece of collection of different spoken word pieces of poetry, and the found sounds that she incorporated into that to connect to the written word. We did a panel on her at ISA after she died, and I remember preparing for that, trying to collect my thoughts and looking up some of her work. And I thought I knew her academic work. I thought I was familiar with it from having worked with her on the journal and all the conversations I'd had with her. And I had no clue. Like I had scratched what I knew of her work, barely scratched the surface of all of the work that she was doing in the variety of areas that she worked in. Interestingly, I do also remember, and I think it speaks to the profound problems of the Imperial University. I had trouble finding some of those pieces because it was work on the Pacific, and I worked at a university that is quite progressive and committed to the anti-colonial project, and yet I couldn't find. It was tough finding some of her pieces. So again, this collection is so important to bring that work and to make it available. I guess, the other thing is Teresia was a joy to the boundarylessness way, the organic way she interacted with us on the journal. We moved between, again, the personal, the work of a journal. And for those of you who are new as editors, it is such an amazing thing you're taking on, and we all benefit from it. And it is an enormous amount of work. And we thank you for taking that on. Teresia, it wove together the making that happen, and absolutely the cost of that Megan talked about, that was also really clear. But so was the commitment to work in a feminist way with others that always came through. And one, I was going to end there, but I just remembered the other thing I want to mention is that the IFJP's international conferences now a third editorial team is taken on and have done incredible international conferences. Teresia was the originator of the first time IFJP participated in a conference. We didn't hold a standalone conference, but we went to the Oceanic Studies Conference in Auckland. We held the first time the IFJP board meeting was held outside of the ISA, which meant either it was usually in the US and sometimes Canada. And the panels that she and others of her colleagues organized, I remember that same way in which boundaries were not strict. Each one of the panels I attended that she had organized, poets spoke as well as academics. They were the best panels. Any of the others that we had organized from other parts of the world were not nearly as interesting. I met amazing poets at those panels. And again, the way in which there aren't boundaries between these forms of expression appeared in that conference, as it did in her work, as it did in her life. Again, many thanks to the editors of that collection. If I wasn't at my son's, I'd be holding it up along with my CD of I Can See Fiji. Again, if people still have CD players, I recommend you find a way to order that CD. And thank you for allowing me to share a few thoughts on Teresia.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you, all of you, because I can honestly say, having had two other book launches, experiencing two book launches that focused more on the Pacific Studies context and impact of her work, I am so incredibly moved, and this has been so helpful for me, not as her sister, but also as someone who, would always say, well, we have one feminist scholar. How many of those do you need in one family? So, in terms of the boundaries and the flows that everyone's been talking about, I was always very happy for the poetry and the feminist scholarship and even the mama bearness to be Terry's, her role, her job. And so, she often said, sometimes when we ended up in the same conference, too many Teaiwas in one room, too many Teaiwas. There's too many of us here. But listening to all of you has been really brilliant, really, really brilliant, and genuinely something different and new and fabulous for me as a pathway to reconnect with my sister's work as well, because this process was really personally very, very difficult and challenging and a little bit traumatizing, to the point where it's hard for me to read her work sometimes or listen to her voice. Like even playing that bit of her poetry, I was like, okay, we can do this. It'll be okay. Let's just hear her voice. April is very familiar with that journey, but it's been fantastic, really, truly, to hear from all of you and to be reminded of the nature of her impact and her work and just the different ways in which it's been so significant to many. And I think it would be brilliant to end with what Beth has proposed to everyone, which I can see in the chat, and along with some other beautiful comments and feedback from people reflecting on all that has been said. Beth proposed a question to the panel, which is kind of like, where to from here? What would Teresia most want us to pursue, or what path herself might have turned, what path would she have turned to or forged had we not lost her? And I can actually share, this is actually really important, because she said to me on her dying bed, she reminded me about the importance of the well-being issue. So something that everyone has sort of touched on and raised here, that's where she wanted this to go. She said to me, Kati, this stuff is really important and you kind of know how to do this. You bring essential oils, you're trying to put it on my feet. I was like in the room with frankincense and she was like, what is that? I was always obsessed with the wellness and the well-being and the healing and the spiritual issues. And she was creative and pragmatic and in a way, the opposite of a lazy native. She was driven by work and perfectionist and detail oriented. And at the end, when with some of her last breaths, she realized, she said, I have nothing left for myself. I actually have nothing left for myself. My battery is down. I was trying to teach her the Ujjayi breathing that I'd learned in my pregnancy classes. And she was like, I can't do that. Do not bring this like breathing thing in here. There's no more space. My battery is low. I am done. I've run out of energy. She said, but that is where this needs to go. This needs to be some kind of critical think and creative thinking about healing, well-being, wellness, not in that or maybe in that annoying way you see it in all of those super annoying women's magazines, where it's like this hyper individualist form of intense well-being that we can all somehow transformationally arrive at. I think she was talking about something that, similar to the rest of her work, would have been more profound, inclusive, holistic, relational, connecting across all of those borders and barriers and boundaries, all of those different topics and genres and forms of expression that people have discussed here. That's where she wanted us to all go next. And then COVID came and climate change came, and climate change has been here, but she was onto it. Like, she knew that health and well-being in all of its forms and manifestations was absolutely critical, of something that wasn't not part of the revolution, wasn't not part of the resistance. It is part of it. It actually might be the resistance to actually seriously take one's own and one's community and one's family and one's environmental well-being absolutely seriously and prioritize it. So that's how I would respond, Beth, but I don't know if others have other thoughts. Maria.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I did think of climate change, and that my brain's too primitive to be able to imagine and conceive what she might have brought together. But at a sort of basic level, I think the inaction around climate change, and as you say, that Papatuanuku herself is unwell, and that's caused by, all sorts of things. And it seems to me that might have been part of that focus, the social injustices that we see, the question of how to transition to more peaceful, just societies in the face of climate change, sea level rise, managed retreat, those factors, and thinking about how we do that and create better societies, I think could have been one of those things. And West Papua, of course.
I was going to mention West Papua, and that also, I think, connects to an area that she was moving in or moving towards when she passed, which was that she was starting to publish about being Black in the Pacific, being an Indigenous Pacific woman and a person of African descent. So that had always been a key part, obviously, of Kati and Teresia's and their sister Maria's family and identity. But it hadn't featured so much in Teresia's scholarship. And at a Pacific History Association conference in Guahan, a year before she passed, Teresia had organized a panel and then published from that panel a collection of women who, like her, were of mixed African and Pacific descent. And I mean, she was really kind of at the forefront of what is an emerging and interesting scholarship now that is looking at Black Pacific experience, not just the experiences of Afro-diasporic peoples in the Pacific, but also looking at Indigenous oceanic Blackness in the Southwest Pacific, in Australia, and the ways in which those conversations are coming together in a really exciting and burgeoning area of scholarship now. And so I think she'd be right in there, and she's, as I watch that scholarship and those conversations, and it's not just scholarly, it's beyond the academy as well, that the incredible activism. As I watch that emerge, I'm just constantly feeling the loss, for so many reasons, obviously feeling the loss of Teresia, but I mean, she would have been in there and in that conversation, and in really, really necessary ways.
Does anyone else want to add to what you think she might have turned to or would be doing now? I totally agree about climate change. We would have had the best climate poetry to join all the other amazing climate and environmental poets that are out there. But we are thinking of the next book being the poetry book. So just stay tuned for that. It's It's gonna happen. There are things in the works. Shine, Scotty.
Katie, I just wanted to add to that discussion, and maybe I am perhaps not the best person to be saying this, but Teresia and I were on a panel that I had organized at ISA several years ago, I've forgotten which year, and I reached out to her. I remember the tremendous generosity with which she accepted invitation without knowing me at that point of time and, studying what the panel was. But in terms of just thinking about the work that interested her, that panel was on difficult conversations within feminism. And I think this was a conversation also repeatedly that occurred in the Facebook space with which I was connected to her, and we exchanged messages. So I wonder if that might also be something that she would have contributed to very powerfully at this point of time when we are all struggling to make sense of the world, and as feminists, as the whole conference that we have organized is about that. It's about multi-locational, multi-voices, and where feminism, whose feminism, and where feminism would go. So I do think that she would have a lot of things to say here and inspire us. Thank you.
And just adding to that, but also aware of time. I mean, I have no ability to imagine what she would be doing, but I'm sort of thinking what we could be doing together, right? If she was still with us and working in IFJP space and security studies in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I remember when I first met Teresia, was in ISA at Cindy Weber's talk, and she just, I had just happened to sit next to her in the audience, and she introduced herself. I mean, I just finished, it was my first ISA. I was a recent PhD from Northern Ireland. She gave me her business cards, one IFJP card and one Victoria University of Wellington. And I've never heard of Victoria University of New Zealand. I've never received a card from New Zealand. I mean, so it was one of these moments where I felt that, and so when I did take the job in 2017 at Massey University, she was the first person I knew here beyond the people who hired me at Massey. And that's also when she was sick. So kind of thinking in the context of the conference and the conversation and the importance of her work and her life, the question of how do we interlink across regions and how, in a way where area studies, histories of the discipline, and our own personal histories really do not give us the right language and ability to connect in a way that is, the reason poetry is important is because it's about letting go, right? It's about deep breathing in some ways, right? It's about trying to find the humanness in the moment, and that sort of connection that is not antithesis to academia or intellectualism or theory or criticality. It's the thing that creates it, right? And it's what it's for. And just trying to find a way to do that in conferences, even IFJP convened conferences are difficult. It's difficult. And so how do you do that, especially when actually being in one location is impossible? It's really hard and inaccessible and expensive and not viable for so many people that we want to be in conversation with. So I mean, the hybrid format, as much as we find it difficult, I think we have to find a way to make time and reorient ourselves. Not the entire selves, but parts of ourselves in a much more fragmented way. And the concept of articulated limb, the trauma, the limbness, the fleshiness, I think that is important. Remixed, yes, I think we need to have that conversation at a different time because we are definitely running over time. But it's been such a joy, and thank you so much, everyone, and Katerina in particular for joining us. I know this was a really tough thing to say yes to, given all your commitments. Thank you.
Thank you for making space for this. It's been wonderful. It really, really has. So I wish you all the best for the conference and the gathering and all the other amazing conversations that you're going to have, and your generosity as well, you know, to take for the time and the energy and the thought and the care that went into creating a space for my sister. I know she would be, you know, she would be thrilled. She'd be so happy. She would appreciate it. So thank you to everyone who spoke and for all the questions and comments. It's been truly wonderful. Vinaka Vaka Lebu Sara and Kampasin Rapa.